6 months ago in Vietnam, the only alternative before us was force or withdrawal. And I think that withdrawal would be totally unrealistic and would be a catastrophe. The second alternative, which I now speak of, is the conference in Paris. The negotiations are underway. They're not making a great deal of progress, but they are underway. Now, we've been seeking to get those negotiations for years. The roadblock to peace, my dear friend, is not in Washington, D.C., it is in Hanoi, and we ought to recognize it as such.
Over 4 days and nights, sporadic battles in the streets were echoed by angry debates on the war inside the convention hall.
It is altogether too late here for us to begin to discuss the merits of the war in Vietnam. That question has been presented to 7 million Democrats across this nation. That question was presented in the states where there are primaries, and the people have found an indictment of that war.
Most delegates to this convention do not know that thousands of young people are being beaten in the streets of Chicago.
Wisconsin is not recognized for that purpose.
The interesting thing was that the size of the protest against the war became so large that it was impossible to avoid it as a news story. A lot of people say we were manipulated by that. I don't think so. We had learned to avoid manipulation, and we were simply responding to masses and masses of people. If you think of the 1968 Democratic Convention and the fighting on Michigan Avenue in Chicago between hundreds and hundreds, perhaps thousands of demonstrators, it was a story of inescapable news value. It had to be covered.
The demonstrators were trying to march on the convention hall without a police permit. Blocked, they sat down in the street.
I've never seen anything as horrible in my whole life. Look at it, Dr. Keller.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. The victory is ours. The victory is ours. The victory is ours.
Get in, lady.
Don't throw anything.
And I remember Walter Mears of the Associated Press writing a lead the night that Hubert Humphrey received a Democratic nomination at that convention, and he wrote something like, Hubert Humphrey, a man of peace, received the Democratic nomination tonight under armed guard.
It would have been impossible to hold the Democratic National Convention in any city in the United States or throughout the world without demonstrations or disruption. Daley's right on this point. Chicago just happened to be the city. It would have been impossible to hold it anywhere because the Democratic Party has blood on its hands. And because there's a struggle going on in the world today between young people and between those old menopausal men who run this country. And it's a struggle about what the future of this country is about.
Well, Chicago was a sort of sad time because if you've been involved in the politics and the process of talking to people and going out and talking door to door, what was quite clear was that a great many of the American people, in fact, were sympathetic to the anti-war movement. And yet suddenly the image that they got was not of this nice young person coming to their door and saying, wouldn't you like to vote for Gene McCarthy? But of people shouting obscenities and disrupting the city.
But it weakened the anti-war movement around the edges, at least. And that became, the edges became what Richard Nixon played on.
The Republican candidate delivered a familiar campaign message to Chicagoans a week after the Democrats went home.
My friends, let me make one thing clear. This is a nation of laws, and as Abraham Lincoln has said, no one is above the law, no one is below the law, and we're going to enforce the law, and Americans should remember that if we're going to have law and order.
Handicapped by his support of Johnson's war policies, Humphrey had trouble taking the offensive.
I believe the Republican candidate owes it to the people to come out of the shadows. Would you mind bringing your television camera down here? You fellows do an awful lot to promote that with that camera. Now, come on down here, will you? Knock it off, will you, please?
While Humphrey tried to separate himself from Johnson, Nixon lumped them together in attacks on the administration's record.
Let me tell you what those 4 years have done to America. The longest war that America's ever had in its history. The worst crime wave we've ever had in our history. The highest taxes we've ever had in our history. The highest rate in the cost of living that we've had in a generation. And the lowest respect for the United States of America in our history.
Let America know that we can't be taken for granted. We're going to have the biggest election surprise that America's known in 20 years. We're going to win this election. Thank you very much.
It was not to be. Humphrey's campaign took off when he called for a U.S. peace initiative, and it accelerated when Johnson declared a bombing halt. But Nixon, promising to end the war with honor, won by a slender margin.
Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
The honeymoon period, traditionally granted a new president, was charged with the expectation that Nixon would unveil a plan to end the war. But during the first 6 months of 1969, U.S. casualties were high. Life magazine published portraits of GIs killed in a single week. And week after week, every Thursday night, network news viewers saw the body counts.
I entered government with the conviction that one could create a large consensus behind a reasonable program, which would then impress Hanoi with our determination to be both conciliatory, but also to indicate the limits of our conciliatoriness. That objective we never achieved because the moderate groups always felt they had to be a step ahead of the administration.
This protest is directed not toward the young men, American or Vietnamese, who have fought and died.
The notion of the moratorium was a pretty straightforward one, which was that we had to take the anti-war movement off the campus and build it back into the community. That meant you had to have language that was moderate and not strident and off-putting. That you had to have people, events which moderate people could participate in. It had to be locally organized so that people knew the people who were organizing it. And sort of heartland folks had to feel that it belonged to them.
It's going to be a wake of death. There are millions of government officials in all these little towns that support the United States.
But the problem is, most of South Vietnam support the Viet Cong.
In Washington, the moratorium drew 50,000. Over 1 million participated nationwide. North Vietnam's Premier Pham Van Dong sent a message of friendship to the organizers.
Now, this message from a communist regime in North Vietnam is a shocking intrusion into the affairs of the American people by an enemy power. I think that the leaders of the demonstrations are chargeable with the knowledge of this communication and responsible to the extent that they must make perfectly clear what these demonstrations are for.
The moratorium ended with candlelight ceremonies in Washington and elsewhere.
All I wanted to say was that I am for peace, that I'm not exactly sure how it should come about, but I'm saying that because I want peace, I'm standing here, I'm marching, I'm holding my candle.